our online event today, so bear with me and we will start right away. Okay, I think we can go ahead now. So hello everyone for this year's first feminist exploration. Before we get started with the content, I would like to make a quick statement and let you know that we declare full solidarity with Ukraine. We stand by the side of the Ukrainian people, our partners and our colleagues over there. And we also stand by the side of our partners in the Russian civil society who are under harsh state repression. Today, we will discuss demography in the EU institutions, and we are very glad to have you here in this space. My name is Zora Siebert, and I'm heading the EU Policy and Democracy Program at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation European Union. The Heinrich-Böll Foundation is a political foundation affiliated with the German Green Party. Our primary task is political education and advocacy in Germany and abroad. We place particular emphasis on gender equality and diversity in our work. I'm very proud that we can host this event with the support of the Gunda Werner Institute for Feminism and Democracy in Berlin. My colleague is going to post the link to the Gunda Werner Institute in the chat. These feminist explorations have been initiated by the European Feminist Platform, a network combining the work of feminist scholars, activists, and policymakers. The platform advocates and fights against the backlash of the far right. We try to create a strong bond of feminist solidarity all over Europe and beyond. You can see what the European Feminist Platform is doing also in the link in the chat. A few notes on housekeeping. So this event will be recorded, and as all editions of this series, you can find them in our YouTube channel. We encourage all of you to ask questions, and this works by adding them to the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Please note though, when you ask questions or put in a comment, don't be disrespectful or insulting, because participants who don't respect this rule will be removed. In today's exploration, we will talk about the demographic challenges the EU is facing. The new e-paper, Discourses on Demography in the EU Institutions, analyzes why and how talks about demography are hijacked by illiberal, right-wing, and conservative forces. It explores the main actors in the EU institutions by looking at tweets and official documents by the European commissioners and the members of parliament. My colleague will post the link to the e-paper in the chat. So what will you learn today? With this discussion and the e-paper, we are presenting the first quantitative analysis of historical Twitter data in the field of demography. You will learn that it's necessary to disclose the dangerous and gender-specific and racist consequences of right-wing and conservative demographic policies. You will also find out that demographic political agendas need to be combined with social and feminist issues. And you will also learn that there's a need for progressive actors to step up in the discourse around demography. We were supposed to hear from Terry Reintke, an MEP for the Greens EFA, and member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality today. However, Terry is unfortunately sick. We are still in a global pandemic and is not able to join us. So we hope that Terry will get better very soon, but we're still looking forward to hear from our authors. So the authors are Swantje Höft, Master Student of Gender Studies at CEU Vienna. We have with us Judith Götz, literary scholar, political scientist, and member of the research group Ideologies and Politics of Inequality, as well as the research network Women and Right-Wing Extremism. We have Livia Ola, Associate Professor of Demography at the Department of Sociology at Stockholm University. And we have Andrea Peter, historian and professor at the Department of Gender Studies at CEU. After the presentation, we will hear from Shalini Randeria, President and Rector at the Central European University Vienna, who will reflect on the paper's findings, followed by a debate with you. So don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. And now I'm very glad to pass on the microphone and the screen to our authors for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Zora, for this opportunity. And I will start as one of the members of the European Feminist Network. And I'm so happy to be here. And we have a small presentation. And I would like to start with this question of, why feminist demography? Because, I mean, demography is something what somebody might consider extremely boring, but in this first 3 minutes, I will be arguing that this is crucial to understand why demography was taken, hijacked, instrumentalized by the liberal forces. So before doing that, I would like to emphasize the importance that we have got this collective authorship of 4 scholars from very different background. And I'm particularly happy to have our fantastic MA student of gender studies with us here. And we are actually exploring how demography as a form of inquiry became or turned from a foundation of the progressive social engineering to the place where it was appropriated by illiberal forces. And this is especially important because social scientists and politicians were totally surprised when there was this rise of demography, and even a commissioner was appointed with demography in her portfolio. And it is obvious that it became a part of the global struggle for liberal values and also for protecting academic freedom and science, how this kind of appropriation is happening. And also the aim of this report to, besides shedding a light of the importance of this changing face of demography, to move away from these traditional explanatory factors, which is the orientalization or using Prime Minister Orban's name as an explanation of the present illiberal shifts. And we are trying to explain why and how the progressive forces are at the moment losing the battle against the liberal forces in the field of demography. And of course, how can we win this again? And if we go to the next slide, I would give 4 reasons why demography as a field of inquiry and as a scientific field was so vulnerable for this illiberal takeover. First, because the other fields in social sciences had moved towards post-structuralist epistemology and methodology. And the study of demographic events remained in this framework of positivist analysis. And also because it's representative of the modernist ideology, it assumes certain objectivity. So it radiates objectivity, and it still measures social differences with the category of men and women. And this kind of data is used by policy makers and avoiding the concept of gender. In this way, because of these 4 reasons, demography unwittingly become an important ally of illiberal forces. So why demography is important? Livia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So the recent demographic developments in the EU provide the background for our report. And here you see several graphs. So let us start with the first one, which shows what is going on in the EU and in Europe at large. Basically, since the end of the so-called golden age of the family, which was the late 60s, we have seen declining fertility in Europe and in the European Union. By the mid-1970s, the total fertility rates declined below 2 children per woman on average. And the lowest levels were reached in the late 1990s, it was below the so-called critical level of low fertility, 1.45 children per woman on average. In recent years, we have seen a slight fertility recovery, but still fertility is at 1.6 children per woman, which is very low, since the replacement rate is considered 2.1 children per woman on average. So we are way below that. Such a substantial fertility decline has implications on the population age structure. Notably, an increasing proportion of the population are now in the retirement ages. And of course, this has implications for the old age dependency ratio, which you see in the next graph, that it is increasing. The major challenge with such development is, of course, the sustainability of the pension system, the healthcare, and elderly care. In the early 2000s, we had 4 working age persons per each elderly person. But by 2050, it will be less than 2 working age persons per elderly person. So how sustainable is such development, one can ask. The third diagram, the third graph, shows how the population age structure looks like more recently. Given these 2 main forces that we have just discussed, the declining and very low fertility and the increasing share of the elderly in the population. Since 2005, we have fewer children below age 15 than elderly in the population of the European Union. And as we see in the next population pyramid, by 2050, we will have a severe distortion of the age structure of the EU countries. We will have a large portion of the population in the elderly fragment, and there will be relatively few children. And the major concern is, of course, that we have a shrinking and aging labor force. And the last graph addresses that there might be a short-term solution for this shrinking and aging labor force, namely immigration. We know that during the 2000s, the EU received substantial migration flows, especially from outside EU countries. And this is what this yellow line shows here. Since 2015, the annual inflow from outside EU countries to the EU is more than 1 million people. So yearly, more than 1 million people, this is the net flow. Of course, such a massive immigration would also pose certain challenges, namely the integration of the migrants into the society and, of course, into the labor market. So the awareness about and the interpretation of these trends by EU institutions are of crucial importance for future policymaking. And this is the explanation for our study. Next slide, please.
So now we will come to the data analysis and the empirical findings. In the study, we analyzed 3,041 tweets in total from 523 Twitter accounts. This included the formal Twitter account of the European Commission, the 7 political parties in the European Parliament, and the EU parliamentary members. The tweets were analyzed over a period of 6 years, from 2015 till summer 2021. In the frequency table on the slide, you can see how the different political parties in the EU Parliament tweeted about demography. And you can also see how in this period of 6 years, there were just 311 tweets in total who contained the word demography. So it is really still under-addressed. Next slide, please. In the data, we could find three main drivers of demographic change were identified by the EU institutions: the aging population, migration and mobility, and decreasing and low fertility rates. We found as well that three main positions stood out among the different European actors. There is the EU Commission, which is of course the most dominant and influential position, then right-wing and conservative forces, and rather liberal and progressive forces. You can see this on the table on the slides. So that's already next slide, please. So in what follows, I will explain more concretely how these different drivers are addressed by the different EU actors. So with regard to the aging population, it is a shared concern among the different EU actors. The EU Commission under Ursula von der Leyen also identified the focus of other demographic dimensions like migration and low birth rates by creating the new Vice Presidency for Democracy and Demography, for which Dubravka Šuica was assigned, as well as a new Vice Presidency for Promoting a European Way of Life, for which Margaritas Schinas was assigned. The term European Way of Life has been highly criticized for using dog whistle terminology, as the Green IFA MP Philip Lamberts stated. Next slide, please. With regard to the future of the European population, the EU Commission builds on a UN forecast and highlights that Europe's share on the world's population will decrease from 12% in the 1960s to 4% in 2070. With this way to single out the demographic destiny of the European Union and avoid to mention that other industrial nations such as the US, Russia, and China having the same demographic future, the EU Commission creates a scenario of fear on which right-wing actors can build their conspiracy theory of a demographic winter or demographic suicide, as you can see in the tweet, in the example tweet from the Renew group from 2019. According to the threat scenario, self-righteous determination rights of feminists and the supposedly high birth rates of migrants create the low birth rates of the so-called native population. Further, we found that in some texts, the European Commission presented migrants as cost-intensive burden to the welfare state. Here as well, far-right actors capitalize on the way the European Commission framed the existing demographic challenges. And also we observe that far-right actors use increasingly the work of ultra-conservative demographers such as Gunnar Heinsohn and Bert Hedwig to legitimize their demographic claims. Next slide, please. Recent publications of the European Commission compare contemporary birth rates with the golden age of the family from the 1960s. This comparison implies that birth rates experience a significant downward trend. This framing again obscures the fact that when we focus on the last decade, birth rates have risen again and stabilized, as Livia has shown us before. Policy-wise, the issue of low birth rates is mostly targeted indirectly through promoting new EU policies to improve work-life balance and parental leaves. Far-right actors promote the values of parenthood and family in their agendas, and which they imagine to lead to a so-called demographic spring, which counters the so-called demographic winter for the native population. As mentioned before, liberal and progressive actors do not really address the issue of low birth rates. An exception are Spanish MPs, who primarily target demographic challenges in relation to the depopulation of Spain's countryside, as you can see on the tweet on the slide. And now I will pass to Judith for the conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll now move on to our conclusions. The study we presented here has shown that the political debates on demography continue to gain importance at an EU level. This is proven not only by the documents that have been published by the EU institutions, but also by recently established EU Commission for Democracy and Demography under the direction of Commission Vice President Dubravka Šuica. In the political debates in the EU, however, mainly conservative and right-wing extremists dominate, as they know how to present the topic in their own interest. Our investigation has also shown that the same statistical data, for example, Eurostat, that deals with these topics are consistently interpreted and or instrumentalized differently by different political actors in order to legitimize political action for their respective political purposes. This is all the easier for these actors because, according to our analysis, the demographic discourse may be classified as an open signifier framing of the EU Commission, which leaves an open room for interpretation, which is filled by right-wing extremist parties. Moreover, in the area of migration, the demographic discourse generates an interpretation template on which right-wing anti-migration discourses can build. Finally, the metaphors used by the EU officials, such as demographic winter, can be understood as a clear indication of the hidden political agenda. All in all, this does not seem surprising, as the focus on demographic political issues brings numerous advantages for the far right. By using demographic developments as their key point, they're not only able to address topics of social, family, women's, and reproduction policy, but also to link these with questions of migration and immigration on the one hand, and with gender relations on the other. The narrative of demographic change has opened up opportunities for the extreme right to modernize racist discourses and to establish their topics in mainstream media, thus reaching the so-called center of society. The potential results primarily from the fact that talk of social and demographic change is very widespread and has been discussed in many areas of society. The extreme right was able to build on these discourses and both introduce and further disseminate their mostly racist points of views. Furthermore, we also derived some policy recommendations from our study, which include, first of all, taking the importance of demographic issues seriously and being able to decipher right-wing positions within these debates. Furthermore, the necessity for parties as well as political decision makers and other relevant actors within this field to take a position with progressive points of view needs to be recognized. In addition, the disclosure of the dangerous gender-specific and racist consequences of right-wing and conservative demographic policies is required. Moreover, the current debate on demography at the EU level has no connection with the social Europe agenda, which makes demography an easy target for instrumentalization by illiberal and right-wing forces. Therefore, it is all the more important to combine demographic political agendas with social and feminist issues. This requires the strengthening of feminist demographic research and policy, as well as improved relationships with political decision makers on the one hand and university and knowledge producers on the other hand, in order to work together on the creation and interpretation of data at the national as well as on the EU level. Only a feminist analysis of the data can lead to a rightist feminist answer and solution to social imbalances, we believe. In order to curb the further spreading of right-wing extremist positions with regard to demographic political issues, it is therefore necessary to study the issue more intensively. For progressive actors, there is an urgent need to contribute to the relevant debates with forward-looking positions. Otherwise, conservative and far-right actors will continue to dominate and instrumentalize the debates. Finally, as a response to the illiberal term of demography, the feminist demography cannot be reduced to criticizing the factual, descriptive character of demography, but must offer a constructive and inclusive policy based on the undoubtedly existing social demographic processes. Yeah, I want to thank you in the name of all four of us for your attention, and we're very much looking forward to receiving feedback and your questions. And we are particularly looking forward to the comments of our first reader, the director and president of the Central European University, Shalini Randeria. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Judith, and all of you. And thanks a lot for making this segue to our next speaker. So I'll pass the word and the microphone on to Dr. Shalini Randeria, who will give her reflections on the report, and then we go over to our discussion. So please, the floor is yours. And you're still muted. Yeah, okay, perfect.
I think I unmuted myself. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the discussion today. So my thanks go to both the Böll-Stiftung and your co-organizers, but also, of course, to especially the authors of the report. One of them, a colleague of mine at CEU, and the other, a student of ours. So I'm especially happy to be here and to be able to contribute to the discussion following my comments. So I'll be very brief so that we can go immediately to the audience and get a sense of what are the issues which people would like to flag to us. I think the first thing which is very important about the report is to say that it addresses a very timely topic of great political relevance, namely the framing of demographic challenges which the EU faces, the framing by various political actors within the EU, and how that narrative lends itself to instrumentalization by far-right populist parties. In my view, this is just the beginning of an inquiry into a rather complex set of issues and politically fraught issues, which Europe needs to urgently address. And I think this could be the start of a conversation that is needed across the EU. And let me try and tease out some of the issues which are entangled here, which we heard about in the presentation briefly. So one, I think what the report points to is the politicization of demography and demographic data, that this data in itself is not innocent, and I'll come back to it in a moment. But what I would like to point out is that it's not just the far-right parties which are responsible for the politicization. I think there has been a general rightward shift in political discourse across most of European conservative parties, especially on the question of migration, which are now all being linked to questions of demographic decline, or some people call it depopulation. The most extreme version of this is, of course, the whole discourse on population replacement, population exchange, as it's called, by the far right. So this is, of course, a discourse which is totally saturated with racism, white supremacism, etc. But even if we leave that as the most extreme version of it, I think the mainstream political discourse across Europe has shifted to the right on this entire question. And I think we need to see how, as one would say in German, es ist salonfähig. It has become quite, acceptable to say today that Europe has a demographic problem, and we can frame that problem in terms of fertility decline. And we really need to ask ourselves, as an academic, I think I would say the Foucauldian question: since when is this a problem, and for whom is this a problem? Is it a problem for the individual men and women who would like to have more children, but are living under social and economic conditions and pressures in which they cannot realize their desire for children? Then it is a problem. Is it a problem for the state? Is it a problem for the EU? And why is it a problem? For which actors and since when? And I think if we ask those sets of questions about for whom is it a problem and since when is it a problem, how is the problem framed? Because the way the problem is framed will determine a lot the kinds of answers which we will get. So if we frame it as a fertility problem, which is what not only the far right is doing, but even the EU Commission is doing, then the answer will be, let's increase the fertility in Europe. If we frame this as a labor force problem, we will get a different answer. If we frame this as a problem of economic anxieties, which are being paired with the inability to realize women's desires to have a larger number of children, we may get very different answers in terms of which kinds of welfare state measures may enable women to fulfill that desire for children. So I think the framing is not innocent. The framing is very, very important so the kind of questions we are asking will determine to a large extent also the kinds of answers that we are looking for. So that's one thing that I would like to note here. The second thing I would like to note is that the European Commission's framing of migrants as a cost-intensive burden is equally problematic. The economic framing of this issue is so hegemonic that even the answer of socialist parties, left parties, progressive parties is an equally economistic one. Then they begin to argue in reply to that migrants are an economic asset, that they contribute more than they cost. And this shifts the entire discourse away from the politics of migration to the whole question of diversity, the kind of diversity that we would like in society, what kinds of mechanisms for integration of various minorities should be in place, to a utilitarian calculus. How much do migrants cost? Should they cost little? Should we then have lesser welfare for migrants? Should migrants only get welfare for their children who are in the host society, but not in the ones they have left behind in the societies from which they come? Should migrants only get social welfare after they have lived in the host country for 10 years? So this entire utilitarian economic calculus has shifted away the gaze, I think, from questions of gender, of diversity, etc., which are all part of the problematic that we are looking at. So I think this shift, and it's a hegemonic discourse. So therefore, the left also answers in that same way, making the case for an economic rationale for why migrants or migration is good. We could also have a very different discourse, which says, we live in a highly unequal world, and our life chances are so determined by where we are born, by geographical accident of birth, that migration would be one way of equalizing life chances in a very unequal world. And let's face the fact, we are in Europe, and I say this as someone who is not European, but who has lived a large part, in fact, the largest part of my life in Europe. So the question is, should we be closing our borders to people who were not born in Europe? And so I'll come to that point in a minute. But I think the more important thing here is to look at whether the utilitarian calculus of whether migrants cost so much, are they cost intensive, do they contribute so much, is the best way to think about the problem of framing migration. Then the third point I would like to make is that I think it's important to situate the report against the much larger backlash against women's rights and reproductive rights all over the world. So this is a very, very large backlash on abortion rights, on gay rights, on rights of LGBTQ groups, communities, and individuals. This is a backlash against reproductive rights and women's rights, which is global. It's a backlash by right-wing forces and governments. You can see it in the US, you can see it in Europe, you can see manifestations of it in Eastern and Central Europe, but also outside of Europe as well. I mean, there are fortunately some counter trends in Latin America. We've seen in the new legislation on abortion in some countries that we have progressive legislation. So if we want to think in terms of questions of falling fertility rates, I think we have to think about it in a different context. What is the context of public health? What public health services were available? What public health services are available? And so, because some of those are due to secondary sterility, and I can go into that in the discussion if we want. So these are women who have a child and are unable to have a second child because of untreated STDs, because of a lot of other untreated infections, etc., because of bad public health which is available. The second question I want to link to falling fertility rates is the question of women's choices in a specific context. That context can be of war, it can be of be a context of economic insecurity, it can be of very precarious living conditions, and I think those determine a lot the choices that women make, and we need to be then focusing our attention on addressing a very different set of issues here. Of course, an aging population costs money because medicine is expensive. But an aging population in itself is not a problem. An aging population is a problem because it has certain consequences for the public health system. And of course, with a shrinking population, one will need migration in order to care for this aging population, right? So this is a whole discourse which needs to be combined into the question of labor force, into care, into the whole politics of care. And that is a politics, again, of gender and of diversity within Europe and inner European migration and from outside. One major and fourth point I would like to make, and then I have two more points and I conclude, is the whole question of ethno-nationalism, which underlies this entire discourse of demographic anxiety. So, you know, as the Indian anthropologist Ajanta Padurai has called us, this is the politics of small numbers. There is a fear of small numbers here, which is constantly, why is it a problem that the number of Europeans in the world population is declining? For whom is this a problem, and why is this a problem, right? So I'm reminded of Hans Magnus Enzensberger's wonderful formulation. He says this, we could call this demographic bulimia. The boat is full, but there are too few Europeans in it. The boat is full, but there are too few Germans in it. Why is that a problem? And for whom is this a problem? So I think we really need to think of the totally schizophrenic discourses of overpopulation in Africa. There are too many Indians, there are too many Chinese, or there were until they had this draconian one-child policy. Now China is trying to reverse it, right? Having pushed it down with the most draconian measures, repressive measures, down to one child. Now they're trying to get the women to have a second and a third child, unsuccessfully in most cases, because it's very hard to reverse this kind of shaping of women's and also men's desires, as the Chinese government is now realizing. But here, I think we really need to look at the whole question of loaded terms like demographic winter, but also demographic security, which is something which we didn't have mentioned. It's a securitization of the demographic discourse, which would cause us equal concern. Many Eastern European countries, Central Asian countries, this frames women's fertility and men's and women's choices on when to have children, how many children to have or not, as creating insecurity for the nation. Yeah, and this is linked to because the nation can only be thought about in ethno-nationalist terms. So it's an ethnic group to whom the nation belongs. So any migrant who doesn't belong to it is creating a national security crisis. Yeah, women are creating a crisis by not procreating for the nation. Migrants are creating a crisis by being somewhere where they should not be because they don't really belong. So for those of you, I don't know, I find it always very disconcerting, these Zooms, because you don't see the audience and you don't know who they are and what they're interested in. But if it is a German audience, I don't know, depending on your age, you may remember Chancellor Schröder's famous Green Card initiative, to which the CDU's political slogan was Kinder statt Inder. Yeah. So they said, oh, all these Indians coming in are a huge problem. But if all the German women started to have children, then we won't need the Indians to come in with the Green Card initiative. Yeah. So this is this entire mindset, I think, which this report challenges in a very interesting way. As far as the data in the report is concerned, this is the beginning, as I said, I would suggest to go beyond the analysis of Twitter. I think we need to analyze the green papers, the annual fora, the biennial, triennial reports of the Commission. And what I would like to underline also is a lot of the political positions which you are seeing reflected in the Twitter analysis, which is extremely interesting to see how it's the predominantly right-wing parties, but these are domestic national parties and their particular positions and leaders at home. So we really need to then see what is the national politics here, which is getting reflected at the EU level, because we don't have European or pan-European parties, and what is the Commission's politics. Let me quickly come to the Commission's politics. I find the tying in of democracy and demography very interesting. I'm asking myself, why is this suddenly a problem, such that it needs a commissioner in charge of that? Because this focuses on the question of who exercises political rights. This is about citizenship rights now, and it's about belonging and exclusion in order to further a pro-natalist and a nativist interpretation. Similarly, I, of course, feel very strongly about a framing in terms of European way of life, because I don't know what the European way of life is. And I would really like to try and understand what a European way of life is. Is it different from an American way of life? Is there a Central European way of life? Is there only a Western European way of life? Suddenly, who belongs and who doesn't belong to Europe becomes a major question. So I would really like to understand what that means. My last point, and then I'm done. The report begins by saying demography has been instrumentalized. Yes, it is true, but I think you need a historical understanding of demography as a discipline. Demography was never a matter of just numbers or statistics. It was not just a question of birth rates or fertility rates. Demography was always a question of quantity intertwined with quality. Historically, demography was intertwined with eugenics as a science. It was always part of social engineering by the states and by political elites. So for those of you who are, a younger generation who don't go into the history of eugenics, just think of Foucault's argument on biopolitics. The biopolitics is intertwined with Polizeiwissenschaft, as Foucault points out. So there was never a demography which was a purely numerical, objective, neutral discipline. It was always part of a political project of a particular kind of state making. And I think that's what we need to remember. So I think the report is to be congratulated for reminding us that the demographic discourse is a great lens through which we can analyze political discourses on gender, diversity, population composition, citizenship rights, migration, all of these intertwined issues, basically the body politics of and the way it impinges on the individual lives, individual desires, individual life chances of men and women across Europe, be they autochthonous populations, natives so-called, or immigrants across all of Europe. And it enables us to look at this in a comparative perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Randeria. That was a fantastic statement. I will give back the word to the authors, because I think maybe you want to react right away to what Dr. Randeria said, and then we come to the questions. So would you like to come back to their reflections on the report? Yes, maybe. So I can also kick off with another question if you would like to have some more thinking time. Okay. I don't see any hands or people unmuting themselves. So thank you very much. I have a lot of questions that actually came up during the presentation and now also during the statement. So I was wondering, 311 tweets over this period of 6 years, that's not a lot. There's a bit of a silence about the issue. So I was wondering, from your point of view, what should be the feminist answers to the demographic challenges, which are clearly there? So what do you think should be the answers that progressives, but also the feminist community can give to the demographic challenge? So anyone who feels happy to answer can just unmute themselves and go for it.
So, Zora, I don't know if any of them want to, but otherwise I can give you one suggestion.
Yes, of course, please go on. I mean, you are also invited to be part of the debate.
I just wanted to say, so I think 311 tweets is not a lot, but that may be an artifact of the method used here. Because if I understood correctly, they analyzed all the tweets that contained the root word demograph, right? In multiple EU languages. But I think if you were to use other search words as well, because often these are in terms of abortion, these are in terms of women's rights, these are in terms of migration policies, so they won't turn up as tweets which are necessarily to be found under the root word demograph. I think we need to widen our search, and then you will get a large number of, much larger number of tweets, not only by the right wing, but unfortunately by all the others as well, expressing not very dissimilar opinions, maybe expressing them in a slightly different rhetoric, but the opinions themselves, I think you will notice a rightward shift. So I think it depends a little bit on the method you use.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe you want to come back on the method that you used and give us some more insights into what you were actually looking at.
Yeah, maybe I can come in here. Oh, Andrea, I didn't want to.
No, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that actually we did that. We did the really broad frame, and it was, of course, a lot of tweets with a lot of debates on the whole abortion issue, which was really much debated in the last year. So, and then we narrowed it down because it was it didn't really capture the demographic discourse, what is presented as demographic then. So it was more the around discourses in a way. So we did kind of, both things.
Thank you, Shalini, for the fantastic comments. And, it opened up a totally new way of, contextualizing the report. And I just want to make a comment about demography as such, as a science. So why this is, we thought that would be interesting for the European Feminist Platform as a report, because as Zora mentioned at the beginning, the European Feminist Platform is working with different working groups, and our working group is the demography working group. And the reason why demography became important is exactly because the liberal forces are using demography as an entry point, as a scientific field, and also as a security field, as you already mentioned. So therefore, we were looking around, where can we find something who are actually counteracting to this particular attack in the liberal appropriation of demography. And also we found some interesting examples which also did not find a place in the report. And maybe Svante or Judith might want to give some good examples when progressive forces actually managed to reframe the discussion and the interpretation of the existing forces. And the second one is that they actually managed to create a much more interesting kind of approach to this scientific field. And because this is also about science and also decolonizing the science, right? So that's why it's a very complex package. And with this small and humble contribution, we wanted to first draw the attention to this problem. Secondly, point out the issues that the progressive and leftist forces are not only not able to react, but they are actually using very much the same argument. And thirdly, that there are some good examples, some cases when it's actually very progressive. So maybe some of you might want to continue from here. And thanks again for the comments, and to be continued, that we can promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Do we have a a direct reply to this. Otherwise, we have two interesting questions in our Q&A tool. I'm going to read them out loud. So the first one is by Sabine Jainski, who asks, how do you view the discourse on pensions in Europe in light of your analysis? Demographics are used here often as a there's no alternative argument for different kinds of pension politics. Also creating fear among the European citizens. And in my view, the framing is only reflected by very few experts. Anybody want to give it a go on that question?
I mean, if I can get in here, of course, we have been hearing by Professor Andrea the utilitarian approach, and that's certainly a very valid approach, and it is used, and it's a dominating approach, what is going on. So, and this is highly influential when it comes to the sustainability of pension system. We have seen most of the EU countries, they have introduced reforms given how the population age structure is changing. But we have been discussing in the report the low fertility, population aging, migration, but whether we can successfully integrate the migrant into the labor market. These are very important questions. And of course, the long-term implications, how all these will come together. So these are really hardcore issues. And we have to make sure that we provide for the increasing elderly population. So there will be enough for everyone to have a decent life. So that's what politicians have to face and try to find a solution.
Thank you very much, Livia. We have another question from Deja Benisic, and it comes a bit back to my initial question of what are the feminist answers to this. So thank you very much for your inspiring inputs. I would like to know in how far demands for legalization of reproductive technologies like egg donation or surrogacy are legitimized through the demographic suicide or shrinking fertility rates. What can be feminist answers to this narrative? That's a difficult one. You don't have to know all the answers, but what would you answer from a feminist point of view?
Well,
I mean,
no, Andrea, please go.
No, go ahead.
Okay. No, I just wanted to say, as you might have heard in the introduction, I'm an expert on right-wing extremism, and I can definitely say that within my research, surrogacy and egg donation is a topic, especially in the conservative Christian right. And but they are positioning themselves against any non-natural reproduction. So they're strictly against any kind of reproductive technologies. So this is not used as an argument to encounter shrinking fertility rates, rather than to improve the natural fertility rates among the autochthonous native population. And I think it's very difficult to find the one and only feminist answer to these issues, because of course it's a big challenge for many female persons to actually get children, and a lot of people suffer due to this fact. But the way reproductive technologies are used in this very moment, it has a strongly colonial and racist moment in it, because it's mainly women from poor countries that function as, or who are carrying these children. And so I think here is another it is very important to see the intersectional perspectives behind these issues, and to combine feminist perspectives with anti-racist perspectives. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Judith. Andrea, did you want to add something on that, because you were both starting at the same time?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I very much, wanted to support what Judith was saying, that there is not one feminist answer. There are very different answers, and something what one must learn from this report is that we cannot really avoid all those debates and public debates. And I hope that this report will also contribute to this public discussion, that how to move the rhetoric from this very fixed direction where the far right and the liberal forces hijacked and moved and somehow put it into concrete. And I also would like to come back to a point what Shalini was mentioning, and that is the issue of the conservative forces. Namely, that not only the liberal forces, but also the conservatives are moving towards the right, and basically the liberals are eating up the conservatives and the conservative arguments. And that also raises the question of the issues of alliance and dialogue, and whom do you make alliances, and you might find surprising alliance among conservatives, and sometimes very and sometimes it's impossible to be allied with certain feminist forces. So in a sense, what we see now is a kind of change in discourses and cleavages, and that's why it's so important to have a kind of intervention into this field with a very strong and important professional voice, because these kind of moments are important when the discourse can be shaped, and this is the moment when the discourse can be shaped. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we have time for one last question. It's more of a comment as well, and I think it's for Dr. Randeria. Why is it so difficult to understand the concept of the European way of life, in particular having been living so many years in Europe? I think it's a bit of a loaded question because the concept is quite debated and not neutral at all. So if you would like to go into that, then please elaborate on your thoughts from before.
Well, for me, it's a difficult or highly problematic concept because, first of all, we need to define what is Europe. I don't think it is an entity which is timeless and has always been having some kind of a core essence of Europe. This idea of a European way of life assumes, and this is, of course, the German ideology is part of this story, that somehow there is a Greek essence which comes directly, historically, to the Germans. In this, to put it in a very polemical way, because I think this question is polemical. Otherwise, I could take it apart in more time if I had it. But the question is, for me, it's a threefold question. One, I come from India. My country is a post-colonial country, colonized by Britain, exploited by Britain, 200 years of economic exploitation, political repression, and cultural imperialism. So if I were to look at Europe through this lens, I would say Europe didn't do very well for itself in the past, as far as its global legacy is concerned. There's considerable skepticism of a European way of life in many parts of the world, which were at the receiving end of much of European imperialism and colonialism. So if my grandparents and my parents fought for Indian independence, it was using many European values, but they used them against the Europeans who had colonized them. So it was also about domesticating in a very different context certain European values and trying to use them against the colonizers. So I think it's a very complicated history of the diffusion of certain kinds of European values, the breach of those values. And I think, this European tendency to think that it can be Lehrmeister for the whole world, that it somehow has a Vorbildfunktion and a Lehrmeisterrolle, that it can teach everybody, it has nothing to learn, because actually somehow they have a superior way of life. I think this is, for me, historically a problematic assumption. It is politically completely the wrong way to go about trying to universalize a certain value. And for me, in the context that we are in, women's equality would be a very important value. The question is, Europe came to it very late. It is not a core European value. Women fought very hard to get to that value. So I think to assume that there is something quintessentially European about it is something I find problematic. I mean, my great-grandmother, not my grandmother, but my great-grandmother, had a university degree in India. She got a bachelor degree in 1901. 1901. This was a time when most European universities would not allow women to go to university. So I think, I look at this from a slightly different point of view. You can say, so I'm worried both about a way of life and I'm worried about the European. You can say to me, and I'm worried about European values. You can say to me, there are certain European institutions. Yeah, so I'm not even going into the history of fascism. Should we say this was a European way of life? No, but it was also European, also diffused to other parts of the world. So the question is, for me, here, the most important point would be to say there are certain European institutions, and among them, I would say a liberal democracy and a welfare state. Those are institutions that I think, if we want to define that, then we have to define it very carefully. And I think those are institutions worth diffusing, worth globalizing, and worth preserving. So I would be a very, very fervent advocate for the rule of law, for liberal democracy, for independence of a judiciary, for human rights, which I don't think are a quintessentially European way of life, because Europe flouted them everywhere else in the world. So there are certain institutions, and including, and this is where we would come back to your report, I think the welfare state would be, for me, a very, very important European institution, which would be worth not only preserving in Europe, it's under huge attack here, and the pensions question comes into the attack because of neoliberalism. But I think women's rights and women's equality are very much better preserved under certain kinds of welfare regimes than others. And the fact that women are unable to realize some of the desires for children that they may have may be due to the fact that we are dismantling some of those very important European achievements since the Second World War, but they are recent achievements in certain European countries. It doesn't make it, for me, a European way of life.
Thank you very much, Dr. Randeria. I was going to stop you here because we're running out of time, but you finished this nicely. So yeah, maybe just like the concept of demography, it is the European way of life is also framed as an open signifier. A lot of people understand a lot of different things with it. So it's not an easy thing to grasp. Before we wrap up, I would like to give the word back to Andrea for a final statement of the authors on what should be done now, and then we will come to an end of this session for today.
Thank you very much, Zora. I just want to say in the name of four of us that this has been a privilege to work on this report, and we discovered lots of interesting points, and I would say that the lotta continua. So we will continue to work on this report and think about different suggestions how to work and how to frame this kind of discussion in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much, everyone. Also, thank you to the audience for asking questions. In the coming weeks, there will be a podcast on the report and on this event, so stay tuned and also keep following the work of the European Feminist Platform. There's still a lot of work to do, as we have seen today, because gender equality is not achieved in any country of the world yet. So with this, I'll leave you for tonight, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Goodbye.